people elect a government and then they don't get a job and they see that the ministers are getting rich and fat, they begin to become a little disillusioned with democracy and are therefore open to alternatives.
Hello and welcome to the conversation, Professor Nicholas Westcott.
Good morning.
So you and I met in Ghana in West Africa when you were the British High Commissioner, and I think I was covering First Oil for an English paper. It must have been 2010, more or less. I have seen that you've since been also ambassador to Togo, Niger, Ivory Coast, and Burkina Faso. So you're particularly well placed to tell us what you think of the recent coups or series of coups in West Africa.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great concern. I mean, we've had 8 coups in the space of 3 years, which most have proven successful, from Guinea now through to Gabon, taking in 2 in Mali, 2 in Burkina Faso, and most recently 1 in Niger. And given that since around 2000, the African Union and ECOWAS have been taking a very strong line against unconstitutional changes of government and been quite strict on those who have gone down this path, it's surprising that there's a sudden rash of coups, again, which, again, the African institutions themselves have taken steps to try and correct, but not successfully, in that the coups have continued to happen, and this, for all we know, may not be the last that come along. So, something is happening. And while each coup itself individually has specific causes, sometimes it's personal rivalry, sometimes it's corruption, sometimes it's outside influence, whatever. Nevertheless, there are 3, I think, common underlying causes. And the first of these is really the impact of climate change and demographic change on these countries, particularly across the Sahel, which is on the front line of both. It is both a sort of marginal ecology, and therefore climate change quite dramatically impacts. And this affects the whole belt all the way across from Senegal to Somalia. So again, we've seen, well, not coups, we've seen civil conflicts breaking out in Sudan and Ethiopia. And these are all along a band which has both had the most immediate impact from climate change in terms of not just reduced rainfall, but more erratic patterns of rainfall. And secondly, demographic growth. And this is something we might talk a bit more about, but what it means is there are more people struggling to get access to diminishing resources. And this inevitably is going to create both social, economic, and political pressures. And governments, therefore, have a difficult job to do in this across this region. And again, these countries have amongst the fastest rates of demographic growth in the whole continent, in the whole world, in fact. So governments have a challenge, whatever kind of government they are. And that has been a large part of the underpinning of the pressures that have eventuated not just in the coups, but in the insurrections, the jihadist movements that have also spread across that region of the world. Secondly, this has given rise to some disillusion with democracy. And there was a sort of spread of democracy across Africa after the sort of 1990s. And that was seemed to be very well consolidated. But it's in the nature of democracy that politicians tend to promise more than they can deliver. And if people elect a government and then they don't get a job and they see that the ministers are getting rich and fat, they begin to become a little disillusioned with democracy and are therefore open to alternatives. And normally you should, if you don't like the government, you vote it out. But if, again, and this is the third reason, the constitutional limits are quite weak, so people feel that those in government can manipulate the result, then that leaves force as the only way. And with these weak institutions, a lot of these governments are quite centralized, but quite weak. And therefore, it's very easy. This is the third factor, is that the military, because they can. And it's quite easy. You take over the presidential palace, the radio station, the airport, and bingo. If the country falls in, and the central bank, it's the other crucial thing, and the country falls into your hands. Some other countries have a much more decentralized system of government. It would be very hard, for example, for a coup to succeed in Nigeria, because you take over the radio station and the presidential palace in Abuja, but a lot of the power resides in the regions. And it would be much harder for a military then to exert their effective control over the whole country. So those are three underlying reasons that I think we've seen this. And there is a risk of contagion, because other neighboring countries where maybe you have long-running autocratic rulers, you don't have very strong democratic institutions, again, the military might think, clearly things aren't going well. People may be open to us just taking over and saying, we're going to wipe out corruption and stop the insecurity, whether they actually do or not, and think, let's have a go.
Yes, it's been a difficult summer, certainly for West Africa in particular, with Niger followed by Gabon, almost a copycat situation of the presidential guard, as you say, taking over the presidential palace. Although, as you rightly said, also there are coups and coups, so they're not, whilst they may share some similarities in terms of the reasons that they're happening. Can a coup be a good thing ever, or is this is this inevitable? Given the state of poverty and the growth in demographics, certainly across Africa?
That's a very good question, because a number of coups have taken place in countries where, if you like, rulers have either been autocratic or been trying to manipulate the democracy. And therefore, the coups had a degree of public legitimacy. This was the case, actually, in Niger, back in 2010, when President Tanja, after the end of his second term, clearly wanted to run for a third term. And there was a coup that removed him from power, but then enabled, I think within a year, a transition to democratic elections, after which President Issoufou was elected. And the military happily handed power back over to the civilian government, and Issoufou remained president then for further 10 years, until he in turn handed over to President Bazoum. So that, if you like, was a good coup. And similarly in Guinea, President Alpha Conde was determined to have a third term, and again, so the military intervened. Now they have not yet transitioned back to a civilian government, and in fact, it's inherent in the nature of a coup that taking power becomes quite addictive, and it's then people are reluctant to leave power. We saw that in relation to the coups in Mali. And in Gabon, again, the coup happened immediately after President Ali Bongo had fairly clearly manipulated an election result to put himself back in power. So again, people said, oh, thank goodness you got rid of somebody we didn't really want. But that only really works if the military then do manage a transition back to a freer, more independent electoral system where people genuinely have a choice. And that doesn't always happen.
Thank you. Yes, and we're seeing the spread of jihadist extremism and terrorism happening in countries that are currently run by military juntas, be it Mali, Burkina Faso, and now Niger has experienced also some incidents since the coup of July 26th. So it's interesting, because you'd think the military running a country might mean enhanced security, yet of course they're focused on too many other things potentially. Why are they not managing the jihadist extremism as well as we might expect, do you think?
That's an interesting question because Western countries, the EU, US, France, have devoted a lot of effort to try to improve Africa's own military capabilities in order to resist these. And there have been train missions, cooperations. Obviously, there have been physical military presence by the French, also by the UN, brought in Mali to try and keep the jihadists at bay and maintain peace. And there was a degree of success in doing that. But in all the cases where the military have taken over rule, as you say, actually the situation has got worse. And this is because it seems the military are more focused on retaining political power than actually collaborating with all those capable of resisting the jihadist threat. Why did the Malian government throw out MINUSMA? Partly because MINUSMA needed to be neutral in maintaining peace between the parties. And the junta only wanted somebody who was on their side and ignore any of these caused by government forces and sort of take a proactive role in trying to defeat the jihadists or the communities amongst whom the jihadists were active. So they were seeking a military solution, not a political solution. And you can never resolve these kind of insurrections unless you tackle the political problems as well as military. So what we've seen in all the countries where the military have taken over, the security situation has got worse. And while their sort of justification for taking over power was to improve security and to rub out corruption, both have deteriorated since the military came in, because they're not actually focused on that. And in their search for legitimacy, because they can't claim a popular mandate, they have tended to turn to anti-imperialist and particularly anti-French rhetoric, very much encouraged by some outside forces, for example, Russia, who are very keen to spread anti-Western sentiment. And so Niger has been the most clear-cut case where there was no legitimacy for throwing out President Bazoum. He had been democratically elected. He was being quite efficient. He was running quite an effective counter-terrorist operation in conjunction. So the only justification the coup leaders can find is to say, oh, he was a puppet of the West and we're going to assert national sovereignty. And the virulence of their reaction to also ECOWAS's attempts to say, look, President Bazoum should be reinstated, implies that they feel very vulnerable themselves, the military.
It's interesting. It's interesting that they, I mean, I would expect a kind of populist rhetoric to deter the masses from being sympathetic towards the West. But the reaction towards ECOWAS has been quite interesting because, of course, these are their neighbors, their brothers, in many cases, similar tribes. So that's been interesting. Is this, how important or what role has, do you think, social media and its popularity amongst the youth played in these coups? Because we saw in the immediate aftermath of the attempted coup in Niger, the population hit the streets in support of President Bazoum, only to have shots fired, and they've returned home, went about business as if, you know, this was merely a blip in their modern history. And now there seems to be a new wave of youth chanting anti-French rhetoric. How important is the social media in this fight, let's say?
It has a role and it has some impact. But it's important to remember these countries across the Sahel, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad as well, are still overwhelmingly rural countries. Most of the population live in the countryside. Some have access to social media, but not many. So what you're looking at is actually quite a small audience in the cities, but that's a very critical one because they're the ones who are visible. And it's quite easy to rustle up a crowd and spread disinformation through social media in the cities, in the capital city in particular. And that's why we've seen it's very easy to get a crowd. You hand out a few Russian flags, and the junta, of course, in their search for legitimacy, will play the nationalist card and say, ECOWAS is trying to impose something on us that we don't want. And we're going to defend our country against foreign invaders, whether they're from ECOWAS or France or whatever. So it's quite an easy rhetorical flourish for the junta to try and, again, give themselves some legitimacy and some popular support. And they round up a crowd in town. It's very hard to know what people out in the countryside are really thinking. Most of them just want to be safe and be able to go about their business. And who's in power in the capital city obviously concerns some of them, but most of their concerns are more immediate and more local, being able to keep safe and make a living. So they're sort of open to any government that will help achieve that. So yes, social media has played a role, but it shouldn't be exaggerated how influential it is. But it's amongst a relatively small group who do have influence, and therefore are open to manipulation. Anti-French propaganda sells well.
Thank you. You actually wrote a book, Professor Westcott, a book review, on why African demography should matter to the rest of the world by Edward Pace. So the book and beyond, why should it matter to us all?
There are two sides to this. In one sense, and a very important sense, the growth of Africa's population in the 20th and continuing into the 21st century has been one of the great development successes of the world. Africa was historically underpopulated because its resources in terms of agricultural resources were quite limited, and limits on demographic growth from disease, poor infrastructure, lack of medical facilities, those limits were very, very strong. So the total population of Africa around 1900 was maybe 200 million. And by 1960, the time of independence, it had grown to maybe 400 million. And then since then, it has grown to 1.2 billion in the following 60 years of independence. That's a huge success, that Africa can support such a larger population. Most of it is fed itself. Food has had to be imported in some countries, but by and large, agricultural production has increased to feed a lot of this population. But it is increasingly hard to find employment for many of these people. So Africa is beginning to hit its resource constraints, unless there is a further economic revolution, and climate change is making that more difficult. So if you like, it's a great development success that Africa's population has grown and continues to grow. Also, in a global sense, Africa is one of the very few continents with a growing population. And we see across Asia, large parts of Asia, certainly in Europe, parts of the Americas as well, population is growing much more slowly. And in principle, that provides a huge engine of dynamism for the world economy, that you have a growing market, growing population in Africa, but not necessarily there. The demand for labor is largely outside Africa. Hence, you come to the issue of migration, because people who can't make a living where they are will move somewhere that they can make a living. And that has historically underpinned a lot of the huge migratory movements, which are what a large part of human history has been about. So, logically, there will be a migratory movement out of Africa to the areas of the world where population is not growing, because they need more labor. But that then immediately hits political constraints. People are wary of foreigners. And we are seeing now a sort of migration challenge faced both by Europe, that needs more labor but doesn't want to let people in because it's politically controversial. You see the same in the US along the US-Mexican border. a much faster growing population south of the border, big demand for labour north of the border, but it becomes politically contentious. So it is a global issue. And there's a relatively simple solution, which is to help Africa grow faster so that it is easier for more Africans to make a fruitful living on their own continent. That's what's happened in Asia. That's what happened in Latin America, largely. There was this huge period of very rapid economic growth. It has happened largely in India, which again has grown dramatically, both demographically and economically, and that is now plateauing off. It has not yet happened in Africa. And this is the challenge for the immediate future, how to accelerate African economic growth so that it can absorb the demographic growth that is continuing.
Thank you. You're particularly familiar with East Africa and Tanzania. How are they doing? So that seems to be a similar issue for Kenya, certainly. We've seen a lot of rioting and demonstrations by the youth, and not only, who are desperately looking for jobs. Something William Ruto, who won the elections last summer, albeit contested, are claiming for. How is East Africa doing comparatively?
There's a very interesting contrast with West Africa, because in East Africa, the area of the Horn, Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan, has been riven with instability, political instability, particularly lately. And as I say, that sort of reflects the trend across the whole of the Sahel in that kind of region. South of that, it has been a lot more politically stable. In one or two cases, this is because there are rulers who have been in place for some time and look like staying considerably longer, in Uganda, in Rwanda, and we'll see whether that is a long-term stability or a short-term personalized one. Again, there's risks of staying in power too long. But Kenya and Tanzania have been, in some ways, remarkably politically stable. Both are democratic, they have elections. In one, you've had a party that has been ruling since independence, in CCM, formerly TANU. In the other, you've had a regular change. But both have had regular turnovers of political leadership. And one of the successes of CCM has been that they have allowed change within the party. So it's never been one-man rule, maybe effectively single party rule, but they have liberalized a bit. And the challenge in Tanzania has been twofold. Firstly, to again accelerate growth. They've always been slightly wary of the rest of the world. This comes from the sort of Nyerere-ite African socialism, self-reliance philosophy. So they're very suspicious of outside investment. And that has really limited economic growth in the country. It's a country of tremendous potential, but it just doesn't have the capital domestically to invest, to build the infrastructure that's needed, develop the productive potential of the country. So they need to overcome this reticence if Tanzania is really to begin to accelerate its growth. And secondly, there's a challenge that CCM, having always been in power, can only ever conceive that it remains in power. And there have been increasingly serious challenges from increasingly popular opposition parties. And there is a concern that the CCM will decide, well, whatever the people think, we think we should stay in power, and manipulate the electoral process to ensure that the opposition don't win an election. And that would be very destabilizing in the long run. So for the sake of Tanzania's both growth and future political stability, President Samia Hassan needs to persuade her party, which has quite sort of deep and diverse roots, that it both has to liberalize the economy and accept a liberalization of the political world, which may at some point mean that they will lose power. So yeah, I wait to see how things evolve it was quite clear the direction her predecessor was going. And although he was very popular, particularly at trying to rub out corruption, he had genuine popular support. He didn't address either of those two underlying issues, the economic and political. Kenya has had quite a rumbustious political history, as we know, and its elections have been very hard fought, very contentious. And in 2007, 2008, it came sort of to the brink of breaking out into civil conflict. And since then, the Kenyans sort of pulled back. They pulled back from the brink, and they have allowed a democratic process to continue. And as we've seen, the Supreme Court has intervened from time to time in the electoral process to say, you know, that wasn't fair. It had to be accepted. So I am an optimist in political terms about Kenya's future. But again, it faces tremendous economic challenges. And these are challenges not just for Kenya, but for the whole of Africa. Getting access to affordable capital for investment to tackle the challenges that climate change brings, to accelerate investment, to improve their infrastructure so they can compete globally, that remains a huge challenge. And Kenya faces a debt problem that meant at one stage, a couple of months ago, that they decided they would pay the debt, but not the civil servants. That's very risky. And President Ruto, I think, is finding, for all his hustler credentials, that actually managing an economy in these circumstances is quite difficult.
Yeah, quite. So now on to the Middle East, because I understand you have also been responsible in part for Middle Eastern affairs for our country. I was asked at lunch on Sunday why Saudi Arabia joined BRICS. And obviously there's been some, you know, Argentina, Iran, but let's stick to the Middle East. Why do you think Saudi Arabia joined BRICS? I can imagine why they wanted Saudi Arabia in, but amidst the 40 or so offers or requests BRICS, South African delegation claimed were on the table. Why did Saudi join, and Iran? Could you...
Yeah, the enlargement of the BRICS, which took place at the BRICS summit in South Africa a couple of months ago, is very geopolitically interesting. It was definitely an expansion driven by China that wanted to show that the BRICS was more than just the original 5 members, but it was if you like, global movement. And brought in a lot of their friends. So the Middle East was the big winner. In practice, 4 countries joined from the Middle East: Egypt, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Iran. Now, Iran is clearly a close ally of China. China and Saudi Arabia have recently built quite a close relationship. Because of their brokering this deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And just to have admitted Iran would have been seen as biased. You have to have balance in the Middle East. And you also need to balance Saudi Arabia with the UAE because they're both allies and rivals. One without the other would have been deeply offensive to the other. And Egypt comes in because it's a sort of bridge country between Africa, and therefore it sort of came in as an additional African country, along with Ethiopia, another traditional ally of China, and also a Middle Eastern country that helped balance the Iranian admission. But this reflects an underlying geopolitical reality that the Middle East, and particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, are playing a much more active role globally. They have money and they're willing to spend it to assert their global influence. And therefore they were keen to join BRICS to demonstrate that they are now global players. And they want Western countries, the EU, Britain, France, and the US to recognize them as global players. And this has been reflected already in the fact that they're playing a much more active role in Africa. And Saudi Arabia helped broker the Sudanese peace talks. They didn't get anywhere yet, but it was Saudi Arabia and the US that brought the two warring parties together, not the African Union in the first instance. UAE has been very active all down the East African coast, Dubai ports, our major economic presence throughout that region, and both have been maintaining quite close links with Ethiopia, in Somalia. So these Middle Eastern countries are beginning to assert their geopolitical agency. Joining BRICS was part of that, but it's only part of what they're doing. They are also trying to exert themselves both in their region, and there's a lot of talk now about a deal between Saudi Arabia to recognize Israel, and that would be a game changer. And similarly, Iran was delighted to be admitted to a wider grouping because it's been a political pariah, and it has now had the support of France and Russia to move on to a bigger stage. And all this, from China's point of view, was an explicit challenge to the West, that the BRICS is becoming the anti-West, if you like. Now, I'm not sure all the members buy into that narrative, but it was clear that President Xi made a big play in South Africa of the global South needing to assert itself and seeing the BRICS as a manifestation of the global South against the imperialist West. That's the narrative they're trying to encourage. We'll see whether it works.
Well, this Saudi Arabia and UAE are, whilst competitors, but essentially brothers in many respects, it seems.
Competitive brothers.
Sorry?
Competitive brothers.
Competitive brothers. And so effectively, I understand that they're aligned. Iran, however, I don't understand really how Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iran fit around the same table, because I was under the impression that they weren't friends.
This has been changing recently, and as I say, the Chinese themselves brokered a reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, so they have now exchanged ambassadors. UAE had already been building some link to Iran, and this follows a period of 10 years when there was the deepest hostility between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Through the conflicts in Syria, in Iraq, they saw each other as sort of deep rivals, and basically reached an impasse, and that was benefiting neither of them, and hence the Chinese were able to step in. The Americans couldn't do this brokering job because they don't talk to Iran, at least not in public, whereas the Chinese do talk to us. So I think there is, if you like, a modus vivendi now between Iran and Saudi Arabia. They are not going all out to outmaneuver each other across the region. They're playing down a bit the Shia-Sunni rivalry that had been key underpinning factor in the conflicts both in Iraq and in Syria. And both sides are now sort of trying to make up with President Assad of Syria. He's been readmitted to the League of Arab States. So things are changing across the Middle East, and this is one of the reflections of it.
Interesting. Yes, Syria and Bashar al-Assad being invited back to the Arab League earlier this year as well, which it's my understanding Qatar is vehemently against, is surprising, or is a natural or necessary stepping stone, do you think?
There comes this point in global affairs where you realize you may dislike this dictator, but he's not going away. So do you just continue to isolate, or do you re-engage and try to influence? And I think that's the stage we seem to have reached with President Assad. He's under huge pressure at home. I mean, effectively, Syrian economy has been destroyed. What is left is a criminal economy. They are the biggest exporter of illicit drugs now, manufactured drugs across the Middle East, which is doing damage to the neighbors. and therefore better to engage and try and reintegrate Syria to a more normal economy rather than it just being a criminal economy that's doing damage, but without anybody making any political concessions. So the sort of rebel-held enclave of Idlib still sort of exists under Turkish guarantee. The Kurds still maintain their de facto control of the northeast of the country. And the regime's hold, even in its own areas, is threatened by popular protests. We saw recently in southern Syria, protests against the regime. So Assad needs the legitimacy, and the neighbors actually want a slightly more stable, less criminally run Syria, because it's been damaging themselves. So, you know, it's realpolitik. It's pragmatism that, okay, let's re-engage. We're going to stop fighting and see what influence we can bring to bear.
Okay, now back to home politics. So Brexit. How I mean, we've seen obviously a UK Africa summit under Boris Johnson. We understand that there's a new multipolar world. Some people are calling it, others call it a new world order. In what ways has Brexit changed British foreign policy? And how are we to survive, this new world when we're a medium-sized economy at a time of ever larger economic blocks?
Yeah, it's Brexit remains a deeply contested issue in Britain. It sort of disappeared a bit from the front pages. We have a government that is still deeply committed to the Brexit that it achieved. Our Prime Minister is a leading Brexiteer in the UK, but public opinion has moved quite clearly to the conclusion that Brexit has been a bad thing for the country. Some describe it increasingly as a catastrophe for the country. Our economy has done worse. The influence in the world has shrunk. We see that across everywhere. The influence has diminished in Europe, obviously, with the US, who appreciated Britain as a good influence within the EU when it belonged. In Africa, I've seen it, that people just never understood why on earth Britain would throw away power by leaving the EU, and therefore pay less attention than they used to. So both domestically and globally, it's been a bad thing. You could say there might have been a case for it, but the timing was wrong. Because it was predicated on the fact that there would be an open world economy, Britain could skate freely amongst and trade freely amongst all these different groups, but the world is not like that. In fact, the world has never been like that. And Britain wielded a great deal more economic influence and political influence in the world as a member of the EU because it was a market of 350 million people that carried weight. And certainly in global trade, weight matters. That's why China is influential, Japan is influential, the US is influential, the EU is influential. Britain, with 60 million little consumers, is not influential. So rather than increase our freedom, it has limited our choices. We are no longer able to influence the global trade debate. And while government runs around busily trying to cut free trade deals, they add nothing to significant to the benefit that we can get from trading relationships compared to the tremendous impediments that have been put in place of our exports to our trade with the EU as a result of Brexit. And these facts, which were evident before Brexit, but ignored by the Brexiteers, these realities are now coming home to roost, and people are seeing that actually these warnings were true. How should Britain respond? So, you know, British foreign policy traditionally was based on three pillars: alliance with the US for our security, membership of the EU for our prosperity, and sustaining the Commonwealth for our global influence. And leaving the EU knocked out the central pillar of that foreign policy. And in effect, it left Britain with no foreign policy. All the rhetoric about global Britain was just rhetoric. There was nothing there when people said, so what does that mean? Because such a huge part of our both prosperity and influence had depended on being a member of the EU. And therefore, for the last 4 or 5 years, we've had no foreign policy. The only foreign policy they could find was to support Ukraine. Oh, that's good. That's a good thing, but it's not a foreign policy. So a new government coming in after the next election, because this government won't change that, it can't ideologically accept that Brexit was a bad thing. A new government coming in will have to recalibrate Britain's place in the world and realize that as a medium-sized power not linked, other than for security purposes through NATO, to any major economic bloc, we have less influence and we have to live with the rules that other people make. And it's not impossible to find that way, as everybody says, you know, look at Singapore, they do fine, but it requires a very different set of assumptions, very different approach to the world to the one that the government.
A very different culture, as far as I can tell.
You have to admit that Liz Truss, the very brief previous Prime Minister, did one great service to the country. She demonstrated that Singapore on Thames, as it was called, this sort of, you know, free trading, buccaneering, low tax, low spending idea of what the Britain could be post-Brexit was a fantasy. And she crashed the Brexit bus into the brick wall of reality so precipitately that suddenly everybody sort of fell out of the bus dazed and realized that that brick wall was real and not just a fantasy that they had made up. Singapore and Thames is not possible. So now we've got to sort of go back up walk slowly back up the blind alley that we turned down to the main road and join the rest of the world once more, and try and thumb a lift.
Thank you so much, Professor Westcott. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Anna. Lovely to talk to you.
You too.